Good evening, everyone. I'm Greg Catamatori. I'm the planning director for the city. This evening, we also, you'll be seeing a little bit of a presentation from the consultants that we're working with from RKG Associates. Also with me is Eric Hinderly, staff planner in our department. And I just want to recognize that we have several city councilors here this evening: Marjorie Grace, Val Gilman, Dylan Benson, Tony Gross, not sure where he went to sit down, and I believe Jason Groh is here as well. You muted. We're muted. Everybody's muted. Whew, because that's tough to come back from. We also have several planning board members: David Rosen, Jane Remsen, the vice chair, and any others. Oh, Sean. Sorry, this is Sean. So this evening, we're going to start with a brief presentation about the MBTA Communities law, the guidelines, and then move into a little bit of discussion about what compliance will look like for Gloucester. Also kind of cover what the different venues will be for input. For this evening, we're really focusing on questions around the three things that I just mentioned, and really to make sure that everybody's at the same understanding of what this means for Gloucester, the implications, and how we potentially will present scenarios that comply with the law. So if there are folks that have interest in disagreement with the law, for instance, we are really focused on presenting the city council with compliance scenarios. So the legislature passed it, former governor signed it into law. Those are the folks that you should be talking about if you have issue with the law, want to see it changed. That's the place to have those discussions. And you'll notice this evening that the planning board members, city councilors are in the audience. There's no proposal before them at this point. We are kind of, I'd say, the first third of the process of getting to what will culminate with public hearings in the late summer, fall, where there'll actually be a proposal in front of those two bodies to actually make a decision as to whether or not to adopt zoning that complies with the law. So I will turn it over to Eric Halverson from RKG. And I also want to make one other little comment. Consultants that are working with the city to assist us with a fairly complicated, technical compliance. Myself, we are not advocates for the law or the guidelines, but what we are going to do is present the council with options on how to comply. And I think you will find that there are a lot of options. It is not a one size fits all. There are a lot of variables, and you'll see just from the feedback that we received on the 25th, that there's a lot of directions that we can head in. And there's a lot of ways that you can either promote housing by using this tool, or you can also try to minimize the impact of the law. And both of the several scenarios will be presented to the planning board and city council to that effect. So I'll turn it over to Eric.
Testing. Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Thanks for sharing this beautiful evening with us finally. And we'll try to get you out of here by 8 in case you want to watch the game tonight. I'll be listening to it on my way home. You can't hear me? All right. Oh, that is better. Thank you. Sorry. Great. So I'll hold that. Thank you for the feedback. So we just have a brief presentation, maybe 15 minutes or so, just to recap a little bit of what we had presented on at the public workshop. So if you were here for that, some of this might be a little bit repetitive, but then share with you some additional information that came out of that meeting in terms of areas that people were, at least they expressed in that meeting where they were interested in us taking a look at. And also some ideas around how we could potentially reach some compliance scenarios to present to the planning board and to the city council within the next few weeks. So we'll talk a little bit about, again, just what the MBTA Communities Act is, what are Gloucester's specific requirements, and then a couple of ideas around compliance, and then we'll get to the Q&A as quickly as we can. So what is the MBTA Communities Act? If you're not familiar, at its most high level, what the legislature passed as part of Mass General Law, Chapter 40A, Section 3A, it really kind of hones in on four things. One is it's a law that establishes a requirement for 177 communities in Massachusetts that are either served directly by or are adjacent to MBTA transit service. And for those 177 communities, there are kind of four basic things that the law requires them to do. One is you have to have at least one zoning district of what they call a reasonable size, and we'll talk about what that means for Gloucester in a minute. And within that zoning district, the community has to allow multifamily housing as of right. So many communities today do allow multifamily housing, but they might do it through what's called a special permit. Here we're saying as long as you follow the rules that are set up in the zoning bylaw or the zoning ordinance, you could pursue with a plan for multifamily housing on your parcel. You cannot have any age restrictions in the zoning, and you have to have, you cannot also restrict the housing by bedroom size. So you couldn't, for example, say in this multifamily district, we only allow studios and one beds, for example. You wouldn't be able to do that under the law. And you also wouldn't be able to say this housing that could be built under the zoning is restricted to say those 55 years and older or 65 years and older. Now, there's nothing preventing the city or any community from allowing older adult housing, but you can't restrict it. So it could be an option that somebody could build, but it can't be the only option that somebody can build. Within the district, you have to have a minimum gross density of 15 dwelling units per acre. And then in the case of Gloucester and other communities that are served directly by rail, you have to have at least part of the district located within a half-mile radius of the commuter rail station. So in this case, Gloucester has 2 commuter rail stations, so we have options as to how we deal with that requirement. Do we put it all in one? Do we put it all in the other? Do we split them? Do we create percentages in either of them? So those are the kinds of scenarios that we'll be working through as we go through this process. So at the most high level, those are kind of the 4 requirements that we have to deal with. Commuter rail communities, of which, oh, sure. So the question was, could you please define unit? So a unit just refers to a type of housing or a single unit of housing. So it could be, in the case of MBTA communities, the definition of multifamily housing is any structure with 3 or more housing units located within the structure. So let's say we had a triple decker, for example, a 3-unit building, and it was 3 stories. A housing unit would be the first floor, the second floor, the third floor. Those would all be separate units. Let's say we had a 100-unit multifamily building, a building that had 100 housing units in it. Those could all be divided up into studios and 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, 3 bedrooms. So any of those would qualify as a housing unit. So it'd be something that someone lives in. Just in terms of the deadline, so commuter rail communities like Gloucester, we have until December 31st of 2024 for the city to submit its compliant application for review by the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities. So what are Gloucester's specific compliance requirements? So each community of the 177 have some specific requirements that are unique to their community. So what we have to be concerned about are kind of 2 things. One is what's called the land area requirement. So how many acres is Gloucester required under the law to have zoned to be MBTA compliant? So that minimum area, that minimum land area for Gloucester is 50 acres. And of that 50 acres, 50% of it, or 25 acres, has to be located within one or both of the commuter rail stations. And we could split those in different ways. We could have, as I mentioned before, all 25 acres in one. We could do 12.5 acres across both of them. We could do 80% in one and 20% in the other. It's very flexible with how we meet that. But at the end of the day, we have to have a total of 25 acres located within those areas. And we have to have at least one district, that's that district of reasonable size that I mentioned before, has to be of 25 acres. So let's say, for example, if we created a 125 acre district within the downtown half-mile station area, we would satisfy the requirement of having 125 acre district. And we'd also satisfy the requirement of having 25 acres within one of our station areas. And a good question that came up at our last workshop was, how many acres are within just one of those half-mile radii? There's about 500 acres, or 10 times the minimum land area requirement. So just to put that in perspective, just within that 1/2 mile area, and obviously the city as a whole is much, much bigger than just that 1/2 mile area. There's 500 acres just within that. So getting to 50 acres, or maybe a little bit more than 50 acres if that's the path that we choose to go on, is a very small percentage of not only the 1/2 mile station area, but also of the city's total acreage. The second test that we have to look at is the minimum unit capacity. So the minimum unit capacity relates specifically to zoning. It has absolutely nothing to do with development or building or the construction of housing or the construction of units. It's only related to zoning. And the requirement is that the city would have to, within the designated districts, zone for the capacity to build 2,270 units in total, of which, again, the 50% requirement for the station area comes into play here as well. So 1,135 of the 2,270 units would need to be located within those 1/2 mile areas of the commuter rail. Again, same as with the land area, we could split those units in a number of different ways. Again, they could be located in both stations areas, only in one station area. There's a lot of flexibility there. But at the end of the day, we just have to make sure that we meet at least that 1,135 units in the station area and the 2,270 units overall. The third measure, the density, actually combines the acreage requirement with the unit requirement to get to the dwelling units per acre. So what we would do is we would model each of these districts. We would figure out how many acres we have. We would run what's called the compliance model, which we put all the zoning into for each of the districts. That gives us the zoning unit capacity. We divide those two measures to get the dwelling units per acre. We've done a little bit of work based on some of the comments that came out of the first meeting too. There were a lot of questions about the R5 zoning, which a lot of that is located here in the downtown station area. It's one of Gloucester's more intensive zoning districts that already exists today. And we took a look at, just within the R5 zoning district, how many housing units exist today. And there's already about 4,000 housing units here just in the R5 alone. So I'll show you in a couple of slides about how we could potentially use the law in our favor for the R5 zoning. Because when you have kind of more urban communities like this, that kind of more intensive zoning already exists here. So it actually might be a relatively small change or small tweak to get Gloucester to meet the requirements that the law is calling for. And I'll show you some examples of that. Sure. So we're going to have tons of time for Q&A, but just as a way of introduction, my name is Eric Halverson. I'm with RKG Associates. I'm the city's consultant. No problem. One thing we also had some questions about last time, just wanted to clear up any potential confusion, is within the law, the state has gone through and designated what they call excluded land. And excluded land are different categories of existing land that we cannot use as part of the capacity measures for the zoning. So they would be excluded. You can have them in the district, but we wouldn't model them for the zoning and the unit capacity. So let's say, for example, if we had a city-owned park in one of our districts, there's no proposal to develop that park, even though it happens to be within the district. The development would take place instead, or the zoning would apply to privately owned land, not publicly owned land. Other types of excluded land other than land that's owned by a public entity would be any kind of environmental areas like wetlands, rivers, lakes, ponds, all wetland resources and their buffer zones, any kinds of protected open space or recreational land that the city might own, or other entities that are public or quasi-public. Privately owned land does apply in the case of educational facilities, so colleges, universities, private schools, institutional uses like hospitals, prisons, things like that. So there's a lot of excluded land. Everything in that map that's in that green shade is actually what's considered excluded land. So you can see as we look at the city as a whole, there actually is a fair amount of excluded land that we wouldn't be considering as part of the zoning. Okay, so since the workshop, we've been working with staff in the city to take a look at what might be some potential pathways for compliance, because we're going to be meeting in a couple weeks with the planning board and city council. So we've started to take a look at some of the ideas. And one thing I wanted to just kind of come back to, and something Greg mentioned in his earlier remarks, is although the law and the guidelines do have some requirements that are rigid. For example, we know we need 50 acres. We know we need to meet the 50% requirement. We know we have a unit capacity that we have to meet. We know we have to have 15 dwelling units an acre. While that sounds very rigid and those are things that we do have to work with, the law has a lot of flexibility with where we could consider putting those districts, and also the zoning that we could consider applying within those districts. There's a lot of flexibility there. And I think there are a lot of ways in which we could use the law in all communities, but Gloucester included, to either have a minimal impact or try to encourage housing, or maybe something in between. There's a lot of different ways that this could be applied. Communities that we've worked with, and also communities that have gone through their local approval process, either through their city or town council, or there's been a lot of town meetings this spring where the zoning for MBTA is passed. There's been a lot of different ways in which those communities have used the law. Some have used the law in a way to actually try to encourage housing in locations where they think it's appropriate for their community. And to be quite honest, some communities have taken their zoning district and they've laid it on top of industrial districts. They've laid it on top of existing multifamily housing that already has 500 units. And they've set the zoning so that if something catastrophic happened to that housing development, a tornado came through and knocked the whole thing down, the only thing you could rebuild would be 500 multifamily housing units. So in effect, just because we put the zoning there, it isn't necessarily encouraging anything or discouraging anything. It's just kind of saying, we're allowing you to just do what you're already doing. So as I said, there's a lot of flexibility in the law. Do you want to encourage housing? Do you want to try to comply with minimal impacts? And that's something that we're working through now, is to figure out what are all those different options that the city could potentially take a look at. So coming out of the last workshop last month, there were a lot of folks here, if you weren't here, and a lot of folks, although it was a little chaotic at first, did sit down and did actually provide us with a lot of useful information about where they might want to at least explore the potential for districts. We took everything that was on those maps seriously, and we assumed that they were all serious proposals because we don't want to be accused of leaving anything out. So what you see in the purple on the map here on the right-hand side of the screen are the districts where the vast majority of people had indicated they would like to see something explored there. Now, you all may not agree with all those, but that's not really up to us at this point. We're just trying to do our job and model the locations that people indicated in that meeting. In addition to what you see up here, as I mentioned before, we're also taking a much closer look at the station areas, at both station areas, and trying to see if there are also solutions to get to our 50% requirement, or maybe even get to 100% of our requirement in much smaller areas and be less expansive. So we're looking at all that together. But as you can see, there are a lot of options here. And again, just coming back to the idea of flexibility, there's a lot of different ways in which we could potentially come up with compliance scenarios. And just to zoom in quickly, we know that 50% of that minimum acreage and 50% of that unit capacity is going to need to be within the 2 stations. So that's something that we're looking at as well. Okay, so with staff, we've been spending a little bit more time looking at the R5 zoning district. So the map on the screen here shows you the colors show the different existing zoning districts in the city zoning ordinance that are on the ground today. And the darkest brown color, and this is kind of the area generally bounded by 128 down to the harbor, mostly around, and most of this is encompassed in the half-mile radius around the downtown station. So in looking at this area and looking at that dark brown color, that's actually makes up a majority of what you're seeing on the screen, that is what is currently zoned R5. So that zoning exists today, it's on the books today, and it applies to a good deal of parcels that are already in that half-mile area. So in thinking about the zoning in the R5 that exists today and what property owners can do, either as of right today or through a special permit process, we started to look more closely at the parcels within the R5. As I mentioned before, there's about, give or take, 4,000 units or so of existing housing today in the R5. And you might not know this, but actually 2-family structures, so a building that has 2 units in it, are actually allowed today as of right in the R5. So let's say somebody had a single family, they could technically either add a unit or tear that down and build 2 units today as of right. So they'd come before the city, get their building permit, and they could do that today. So already there's the ability to go from 1 unit to 2 units and densify a parcel by 1 unit. 3-family structures are also allowed, but those are allowed by special permit. So there's an additional regulatory hurdle someone would have to undertake in order to go from a single family to a 3, or maybe from a 2-family to a 3. But again, by special permit, you could technically do a 3-family today in the R5. So taking that thread and bringing it through, a lot of the lots in the R5 are around 5,000 square feet or less. The minimum lot size in the R5 is 5,000 square feet. So those parcels that are under 5,000 square feet today, technically under our modeling, we wouldn't be able to count them because they're non-compliant today. But if you did have a 5,000 square foot lot and you had a two units on that lot, or a 2-family, just in terms of units per acre, that's already 17 units per acre. Remember, we need 15. If you have a 3-family on a 5,000 square foot lot, that's 26 units an acre already that you could do by special permit. So again, as we start to talk about the flexibility with the zoning that the city already has in place and thinking about maybe some more minor changes to the zoning, there are potentially ways that we could look at the existing zoning and come up with compliant scenarios. Just a couple of examples. We had some help from city staff just pulling some examples here in the R5. These are just examples of 3-unit structures that exist in the R5 today. So again, they're between 2 to 3 stories, many of them in the 2.5 to 3-story range. They have a whole host of different architectural characteristics to them. And they exist already in your neighborhoods if you live in this area or in the city. And the other thing I wanted to point out is in the last meeting, we heard some commentary about, we don't want to make this Rantoul Street in Beverly. We don't want 5- and 6-story buildings everywhere. That's not this scenario. If that's of interest to the city, we can look at places around the city where maybe that's part of the solution. But at least as we look at the R5, we're kind of talking about the building character that already exists. As we think about some structures in the R5 that exist today that actually have more than 3 units, there are examples of those too. There are 4-unit buildings that are shown here in the pictures on the top, a 5-unit building on Washington, a 7-unit building on Washington. So again, not big 4, 5, 6-story buildings, but things that are already there that are actually built at a density much more than the 15 units per acre that we need per the law. So we just thought that might be some helpful context as we try to think about what compliance scenarios could look like. Now, another option that we have, as I mentioned before, some communities are looking toward their existing larger scale, higher number of unit multifamily developments that they've already permitted. And I say this quote unquote because we can't count existing units, but through the zoning mechanism, we can sort of take credit for things that the city has already permitted. So the Halyard Apartments, for example, might be one option to consider. That parcel that I have outlined here in kind of the hazy yellow is about 6.2 acres in size. There are 200 existing apartment units there at Halyard. That's a gross density of 32 units per acre, so more than double what we need per the law. So if we were to think about this and try to quote unquote get credit for 200 of our 2,270 units that we know we need, we could potentially put a district over here, zone it at 32 units an acre, and, you know, knock on wood, nothing ever happens to this development. But if it did, someone could come and basically put back what already exists. This is an option that we can explore here and in other locations around the city, again, to potentially minimize that impact. I think this is the last slide before we get to the Q&A. So we have a couple of meetings that are upcoming on the calendar. So we're here tonight, May 21st, doing this Q&A session with you all. We're going to be having a joint kind of planning board P&D meeting on June 6th. At that meeting, we hope to start the discussion with that group about different compliance scenarios and at least starting to take the temperature of what might be workable. Then we have the community meeting number 2 to sort of share out those different scenario options on June 12th. Then we're going to be planning after June 12th, probably a third community meeting and some additional planning board meetings between June 12th and late summer. And we're really trying to get to public hearings and for both the planning board and the city council by fall, just given the deadline that we have of the end of the year. So that takes me to the end of my presentation. I'm happy to turn it over to our moderator and we can do the Q&A.
Do you have another mic? Okay, great. Okay, so my name is Jane Remsen. Welcome, everybody. The rules for engagement tonight, as you can see up here, you're going to raise your hand. I'll call everybody to come up one by one. We're going to have one speaker at a time up here. We're going to try our best not to have any back and forth discussion. So while this person is speaking, I'm asking everybody to be as polite and respectful as you can, not interrupt them, and just let them speak. There's going to be a 2-minute time limit. My colleague David over here has a clipboard. He's going to hold up a 30-second. You've got 30 seconds to go, and he's going to hold up another one that says time when your 2 minutes is up. And I'm going to get out my little Bo Peep hook and, pull you off the mic. So just make sure your comments are brief and in the 2 minutes. I also want to remind you that this is a Q&A. We have the experts here to answer your questions. I'm not going to tell people that they can't express their opinion, of course, but this is an opportunity to learn and educate yourselves about the law. We're not really taking commentary about what we should and shouldn't do. We don't have any proposal on the table yet. That's going to be presented to the planning board on June 6th. And by the way, I hope everybody picked up this blue sheet when you came in, because on the second side, under how I can make my voice heard, there's a list of the upcoming meetings that you all can attend. So that being said, please don't be afraid to ask any question. This is a complex, emotionally charged issue, and we're happy to hear from everybody. So with that, who would like to ask the first question? Yes, sir. You've got a mic over here, and keep your eye on Mr. Rosen over there.
Good evening, Jesse Dole, 5 Willis Point Road.
Eat the mic. Otherwise, we can't hear you.
Jesse Dole, 5 Wheelers Point Road. Can you remind me how many acres is the R5 district? Do you have that information?
So it's a subset of that 500 acres, so it's probably around 430 or so, I believe.
And what's the current unit per acre density with the 2-family by right, 3-family by special permit?
So if every lot in the R5 had a 2-family, it would be about 17 units per acre. If it had a 3-family on it, it would be at 26 units per acre.
You anticipated my next question.
Oh, I thought you asked that. I'm sorry.
No, I didn't know if there was modeling done, if the 3-family was by right,
Yes.
what that did to the unit.
And that's just the simple math of the lot size and the number of units.
The only other question I have is if, for example, we broke these into, let's say, 5 different zoned districts, one district's is it minimum of each of those 15 units per acre? Or is it just a cumulative average of all of those districts? So if you had, for example, Halyard, which I think you said was 32, we could have another district that would be
8.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Before you go, one thing I forgot to mention is please state your name and address for the record. So could you state your name and address?
Sorry,
That's-
third time.
That stand, I don't know if it's going to work really well, so you could just put the mic down. on
Okay,
the,
Jesse Dole, 5 Wheelers Point Road.
Sorry, thank you. Next. Come on up. In the black jacket, sir? Yeah, go ahead.
Peter Johnson, Middle Street, 33 Middle Street, Gloucester.
Can you hold, you have to pick up the mic and hold it next to your,
I can
okay.
lean in. My question, 2 questions actually. So first question is, so you said it was minimum, no, first of all, if you divide, put 50% within 0.5 half mile from a station, that's 25 acres that's needed, right? But then you also said that, what was it? Minimum contiguous district size should be 25 acres. So I just wonder if you put 25 acres within the 50-mile radius from the station, you have to put all 20, and you all need 25. They all have to be within one station, or can we still split them between the 2 stations, if you understand what I'm saying?
Great question. So there's a couple ways to look at it. One is we have to have at least one district of 25 acres in size. So you're correct about that. That district could technically be located anywhere in the city. So if there's a location where it makes sense to have a 25-acre district of contiguous land, it could be outside the half mile. And then when it comes to the 2 stations, we just have to make sure that between the 2 stations, we have a total of 25 acres. So that could be 25 acres in one big district in one single station. We could actually, within the R5, within this downtown station area, we could have like 3 or 4 separate 5-acre districts, or one 10-acre district, and then over in West Gloucester, a 15-acre district. There's so many different ways we can do it, but somewhere in the city, we have to have at least one district of 25 acres.
Okay. So if there's nowhere outside of the half-mile radius with a 25-acre district, then we can split up. We have to put them all either in this station area or the other station area, right? Yep. And my other question was, thank you.
That's okay. I'm realizing this 30-second, 2-minute time business doesn't work perfectly because it doesn't count when the expert is answering your question. So
Okay.
go ahead and ask your second question.
My second question was just real quick, just so I understand. So you showed those different houses, 2 and 3 units, and how many units that would be per acre, and also Halyard. So if you zone those, let's say, for instance, Halyard, the units that's there, they would count towards those 2,500, whatever units that's needed?
Yeah, so this is sort of where the complication in the understanding of the law comes with almost every community, in that the units that are here today, so let's take Halyard as an example. There's 200 units that are already built and existing. As part of the law, we can't count actual units that exist against the 2,270. we would have to put a zoning district over top of that that would allow for as many units as the city is comfortable with. So let's say it's 200, it just matches what's there. As long as we zone for that 200 units, then we could take credit for that with the law.
Okay, so the zoning doesn't actually have to have space for more units, it's just, but,
Technically, yes, that's correct.
thanks.
Yes, come on up. Oh, I'm sorry, you'll go next. Yep, woman in the black t-shirt first, and then the woman with the cool leopard scarf.
Catherine Schlichty, 14 Pleasant Street. So right now in our I-5 zoning, you have to have a 5,000 square foot lot in order to get your two-family by right. And so have you made a calculation about how many of our lots are 5,000 square foot compliant? That's question one. In the half mile around the train station. And is it only those compliant lots that count towards the acreage, or wherever you lay that zoning counts towards the acreage?
That's such a great question. Thank you. Number one, we are in the process of mapping all of the existing 5,000 square foot lots in the R5. The other thing that we've been working on is how many of those 5,000 square foot lots already have 3 or more units on them, which would technically count as multifamily housing under the definition of the law. Your question about the district boundaries is a good one. We can draw the district boundaries any way we want for the acreage piece of it. But when it comes to calculating the unit capacity, we would only be able to count compliant lots.
So that if you wanted to restrict it to just, and I'm not necessarily advocating that, but if you wanted to restrict it to a half mile radius around the downtown station, and you weren't coming up with enough lots to hit the number, another option would be to say, well, we could lower our required lot size. Yeah,
Yep,
okay.
we could potentially do that, yes.
No, pick it up and talk into it like this.
Hi, Pam Steele, 10 Pilots Hill. Could I make one correction to something you said first? There weren't enough maps. About a third of us didn't have maps at the big meeting where we didn't have chairs and tables. I just wanted to get that out there. My concern is there anything in this law that we can use to mitigate the fact that we're a fragile community? Because a lot of the area that you're talking about is flood insurance. And you have to go to the state and it's very expensive. And recently, it's personal, but it ties in with the fact if you bring more housing here into certain areas. I've lived in my home for 50 years and I just got canceled because of wind. I never made a claim in 50 years. Now I'm going to have to go with the state, which is a lot of money. So how does all of that, do you factor into your plan scenarios like that and the fact that we don't have a lot of egress areas to get out of town and flooding? I mean, we are a unique situation here. And I just want to make sure that it's all mitigated before we have to sign on to something.
So one thing that we could do, and I appreciate those concerns and comments. One thing that we could do would be in our mapping is to layer on whatever floodplain information we can find. And potentially, if it's what the city wants to do, we could try to avoid some of those areas if it's possible. So
Yeah,
we can look at
great.
that. Yeah.
That
The wind, I'm not sure I can do anything about with the law, but certainly the floodplains, wetlands,
either.
water, yeah.
That's all going to be factored in before the plan is rammed down our neck, so to speak.
Yeah, we can put those on the map and we can share them with planning board, city council.
And don't forget wind, because that was a shock to me.
Thank you. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Hi there, Rich Carlson, 7 Ratcliffe Street. Can you comment, this is not the first time that upzoning has been attempted. Can you comment on what the experience has been when upzoning is attempted perhaps in other parts of the country.
Can you just define upzoning? Because many of the people in the audience might not know what you mean.
Sorry, we're talking about upzoning. This is one of the terms they use when you do this. It's called upzoning. And it's, again, maybe it's our Massachusetts first try, but have you looked at other studies of other areas where this is happening?
Other than what I read in planning news, no, I haven't done any specific analytical studies on upzoning. I know there are many parts of the country, mostly larger cities. California has been a good example of where they've tried to allow, doing away with things like single family exclusive zoning. Many of our counterparts in New England actually allow accessory dwelling units as of right. Now that doesn't count, as multifamily housing because that's only one unit, but that is an example of kind of more gently upzoning specific neighborhoods to allow for a little bit more intensity. And I think the uptake of things like that are varied and complicated because it all depends on transactions by private property owners, which I think in some respects is the beauty of the United States and being here in Massachusetts, is that the decisions are left up to private property owners. But there's a lot of financial calculations that those property owners have to make in order to say, I want to go from a single family to a 3-family, or I want to add an accessory dwelling unit. There's a cost, and there's also a lot of complexity that goes along with that, which is why I think a lot of folks, things don't change a lot of times when we go from, say, single family to 2-family or single family to 3-family.
Yeah, just a comment, I did find at least one study, and that study indicated there was a 0.8% change over a period of about 3 to 9 years. So that was actually pretty interesting to see that there was very little effect, even when people are trying to upzone. And that was basically one of the messages from the Boston Globe article that we saw recently. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Valerie. Two minutes.
Thank you very much. Valerie Nelson, 7 Sunset Point Road. I would add on the floodplain management that I have looked at maybe a dozen towns that got their compliance application rejected, specifically because they included housing in floodplains. So I think you can't have compliance within the floodplains. Just that's my understanding of it. In the Lanesville meeting last week, a number of questions came up about infrastructure and how to think about locating any more zoning where water, sewer, roads can handle some additional density. And Jason Groh mentioned speaking to Mike Hale, who has an analysis showing that, and this is a big issue for everybody, do we have the water, the sewer, the roads, whatever, that Mike Hale has analysis about the capacity of our water, wastewater, utilities, and roads. I'd like to ask if his analysis could be summarized and made available to the public. That would be a great service, so we could know where Mike Hale thinks, some housing would be, if his report could be made to the public. And I do have one question, not intended to be in opposition to this at all. But the mayor has mentioned that state financing for the wastewater treatment plant upgrade is one of the programs that if we don't comply, we will not be able to receive potentially $50 million in assistance from. So do you know tonight whether the SRF program, the Clean Water Trust, is one of those that the state is saying, if we don't comply, we can't receive that $50 million for the treatment plant? So those are like two infrastructure questions that.
One sounded like it was a data request, and I'll certainly circle back with the administration and Mike on, I know that they've done a water and sewer master plan. Deal with the city engineer almost daily. We work in the same building. In terms of capacity numbers, we obviously had an issue a couple of summers ago. But what's predicted, what it typically operates at, there's capacity within the reservoir system. There's also capacity currently at the sewer treatment plant and planned capacity with upgrading it.
Yeah.
So there are always going to be the potential issues of the local network of infrastructure that will have to be considered with any development. And I think that's also depending upon, what this results in terms of zoning scenarios and what we can also model, because it is, there's a lot of variables that can be included to really understand what the potential capacity increase would be in terms of number of units.
Yeah, thank you for that, if that was made available, because a number of the purple places were in West Gloucester where I don't believe there are sewers, so I guess that would be septic systems. And then if you,
Then your second question, I'm not sure about, so this is an interesting thing. There, as we know, there were several sources of funding that were identified in the law itself, and then that was expanded to 13 programs. But I'll tell you that there also have been applications to programs that are not included in that 13 that also ask about whether or not you're compliant. So as far as we know, I'm not sure if that source has been specifically identified, but some of the funding sources that go into planning for the upgrades are certainly in those programs that would be restricted if we were not compliant.
so the mayor did make a comment to that effect. and I
Thanks,
think
Valerie.
On that would be really helpful. That's a big factor.
Thank you.
In all of that. Thank you, Jane.
Can I just clarify just one thing about the floodplain? Just 'cause I think it is important to understand why those districts were sort of commented on. So you can technically, per the law, put a district in a floodplain or part of a district in a floodplain. It's not counted right now as excluded land. The reason why some of those cities and towns, districts and zoning were brought back or commented on is because within the existing zoning ordinance or bylaw, in order to develop in a floodplain in some of those communities, it required a special permit. And that goes against the by right piece of the MBTA community law. And that also has to do with the FEMA guidelines, the way that they're written now. But as I understand from HLC, those guidelines are actually being revised to better reflect things like site plan review and approval rather than special permit. That's something the state is actively working on right now, but that's the reason why those were brought back for further comment.
Next question. Yes, in the back.
Alicia DeHaye, 250 Western Avenue here in Gloucester. Considering that many towns and cities have issues such as infrastructure, water supply, historical preservation, flooding, etc., along with some cities and towns pushing back against this law, why won't this administration seek to compromise with these cities and towns?
Can you clarify what you mean by this administration? Do you mean the state?
That you mentioned rigid rules with this MBTA zoning. And it seems like this administration, the Healy administration, who has added many things to the bucket list, it is not seeking to work with cities and towns instead of saying, this is the law, these are the rules, the same rules are going to apply to every single town and city here, no matter what the makeup of the town is, infrastructure-wise, et cetera. I just don't understand why the administration won't say, hey, okay, we recognize that you have an infrastructure issue, flooding issues. There's tons of land here in Gloucester in this area that is built on fill. Why can't they work with the cities and towns? It would be a lot easier instead of getting cities and towns pushing back and saying, we're not going to comply. So that's my question, is that if there's pushback, and it's because, well, you're going to do this, this, and this, or else you're not going to get the grant money, why can't they compromise and work with the cities and towns?
Thank you. Let's let.
Sure, I'll take it. That one. I think there's been a lot of outreach from different communities to their legislators. I don't know that there'll be anything brought to the legislature for amending the law, but that's what it essentially would take, is an amendment to the law to change essentially the rules and then guidance from the administration to the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities to change their guidelines. So again, at this point, what we're charged with is to consider it, the law and the guidelines, and come up with a compliance scenario. And there's a lot of variation in what that could look like and what its potential impact specifically is for Gloucester. I know this issue has come up in another of other communities, that the response is the infrastructure piece doesn't have to be a part of your zoning. You might be zoning an area that can't be developed because of lack of infrastructure, but it's just the architecture of how they set up this law to kind of be fairly blunt in making sure that these 177 communities are all participating in the development of multifamily housing. Gloucester's had multifamily housing probably since 15 years after it was established. In many communities, they're 2 acre zoned and they don't have any allowance for multifamily. So I think in a lot of ways, the law is really pushing a little bit harder on the suburban communities than it is on communities that already have multifamily housing. So it's a great question. I think we'll potentially, it would have to come through some activity and a sponsorship from a senator or representative to amend the law.
All I have to say is I think that this so-called law shouldn't be imposed on cities and towns. I think that we should leave it to the local cities and towns to look at the crisis, or whatever you're calling it, and to come up with their own plan instead of a legislature putting their thumb and saying, you're going to do this or else.
Ma'am, your 2
My
minutes
fault.
is up. Thank you very much. Sir in the blue.
John Giangregorio, 35 Harrison Ave. You've described all the various options, or that there's a potential for a wide variety of options for compliance. I guess, what are the standards for bracketing those options from the minimal to, what you might call the kind of just the minimal compliance with the law, to kind of engaging with the spirit of the law and adding more housing than the minimum that is the requirement? Are there any limits at either end on what you're going to be looking at?
Don't think we've set a specific set of guardrails like that. What I think we have right now, and in terms of what we could work with, are a range that's everything of what you just said and everything in between. So
That's a lot of options.
It is.
But
But
you got to kind of pick a path, or a
We-
few paths. I mean, I'm just wondering what the extremes are.
yeah, I mean, yeah, that's sort of what we're working through, but also I think I don't want to speak on behalf of the city. Greg can correct me if I say something that's
Part of
wrong,
the question,
but
I guess, is what is their direction from the city?
right, I think that's what we're going to find out at our next meeting. And that's why we're trying to cast a wide net and say, here are different options. Do you want to go with something that promotes housing? If you do, here's some different ideas. If you want to go with minimum compliance, minimum impact, here's some ideas. I think we need that feedback in June from the planning board and the council members. And then we can start to really hone in on what that might look like.
Okay.
Also, just to add to that, those range of scenarios, again, checking this sheet, are going to be presented to the planning board on June 6th. And that's not a time for public comment at that meeting because it will be mostly taken up by the presentation. But there will be a public forum on the zoning scenarios on June 12th. So that's the public's opportunity to give input into, as the gentleman was saying, which direction we think the city should go. Next question, Deanna? And you're next back there, the scarf.
Hello, Deanna Fay, 3 Barbary Lane. Thank you for this opportunity to ask some questions. I have a couple of questions. One, The first one is around the affordability piece. So I understand that what is allowed under the law and that our inclusionary zoning is a little bit better than what is allowed under the law. And we're going to submit a feasibility study with our application or proposal. Do you have any sense of if other communities have requested to do something deeper than what the state allows, and if that has passed or not, and what the likelihood of that passing? So that's one question. I can wait for an answer and ask the next one, or,
In 27 parts.
sorry.
We might hold your second question and let some other people speak and then come back to you if nobody else has more questions.
I think the first, I'll let Eric speak to the feasibility analyses that he has performed in other communities, but it really depends on what form of multifamily is considered by the planning board and the city council. The baseline scenario is it has to have at least 3 units. So if it goes with a 3-family approach, our current inclusionary ordinance kicks in at the consideration of 6 units. So the inclusionary ordinance is kind of irrelevant at that point. So it's really a matter of if it's some of those higher density districts, kind of like the scenario of the Halyard, doing an overlay of permitting 200 units there at 32 units per acre. That would have to consider, you would have to consider, whether or not that's economically feasible. Ironically, it was applied to that project, so hopefully that would help build the case. But Eric can speak to his experience in other communities.
So you're 100% correct. If a community wants to go above 10% affordability set aside, or they want to go deeper than 80% of the area median income for those units, they would have to do what's called an economic feasibility analysis. We are scoped to do that in Gloucester, should we need to do that. We're happy to do it. We've done 15 or 20 of them for communities so far. To your comment about, do we know how successful those have been? Unfortunately, we don't have comments back from EOHLC on any of the EFAs yet. I think they'll be successful, and I hope they will be. We've run most of them at 12.5% set aside and 15% set aside. Those tend to be the common ones that we're seeing most often. And in most cases, except for the most kind of far-flung communities where rents aren't as high as they are as you get closer to either the coast or to Boston, that's where we're seeing some challenges with feasibility. But in a lot of the communities, that seemingly works. We're just waiting for the comments back.
Eric, that was a lot of percents and alphabet soup for people who aren't, that's okay, for people who aren't familiar with affordable units and the issues around them. So can you just explain the 10% and the 15%?
Sorry, thank you very much. I do that sometimes. So with an inclusionary zoning ordinance, it effectively says, let's say someone wanted to build, just to make the numbers easy, someone was proposing 100 units of multifamily housing. And let's say that there was a 10% inclusionary zoning requirement. That would mean 10% of those 100 units, or 10 units of those 100 units, would be set aside and would be have a deed restriction for those units. And then they would be able to either be sold or be rented to a household at what's called 80% of the area median income. So those would be income restricted units to someone who's earning at or below 80% of the area median income. And that area median income restriction is set by U.S. Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, and it's set for kind of the Boston metro region. It's a pretty big metro region, and that's how the incomes are set for those units. So communities that have inclusionary zoning, they could choose to go above 80%. Sometimes they call them workforce units. Those tend to be over 80% of AMI, up to maybe 120%. And then you have kind of the moderate income or lower income, which are often referred to as like 50% of area median income or 30% of area median income. You tend to see the 30% units mostly concentrated in like units that are owned and operated by a housing authority, for example. So that's where you'd see more of that lower income.
Okay, so, but as far as it goes with the MBTA zoning, this is a totally optional thing.
Optional.
It's no requirement to do this. And in fact, Gloucester already has an inclusionary zoning ordinance, which you can all go look up if you want. But I don't want I don't want the deed a lot of people are conflating or confusing the MBTA zoning with the need for deed restricted affordable housing, when in fact it's not part of the MBTA zoning, although it could be if we wanted it to be. Okay, next question. Yes.
Hi, I'm Melody Fanouf, 3 Centennial Ave. I'm wondering, have you done any of the feasibility studies or any of the modeling for the other train station in West Gloucester? Do we even know what the possibilities are there? And secondly, if we had a chunk of land that we could put a whole lot of housing on, why couldn't we ask the MBTA to move the train station?
That is out of the box thinking. Look at them looking at each other.
Sorry,
Yeah,
no, go ahead.
yeah. So we'll make the presentation that Eric gave available on the city website tomorrow morning. There definitely were some sites that were identified in West Gloucester, particularly around the train station, that were modeled and will be presented to the planning board as well. Certainly an option, and it's really, again, kind of getting that feedback from the planning board, and it's billed as a joint meeting with the members of the Planning and Development Standing Committee as well of the City Council. So it's really kind of, these are the options, and it's not also the limit. You know, if there are other areas that come up in that discussion that should be considered, they can be included. The idea of moving the station, I haven't really thought about that one. So that wasn't part of the exercise, but which station are you saying, the West Gloucester station, or just? If you want to just clarify, yeah.
Any station, we're trying to cram more into an already congested area, and people are having problems with it. So if we have a piece of land someplace that we could put all the housing, affordable and everything else, why couldn't we ask the MBTA in the spirit of compromise to move their station to where we can put it, away from flood zones, away from problem areas? Something that everybody in the city will be happy with. That's.
I'd love to go to that place. But I would say, you know, based on what we have to work with, one of the biggest limiters on development in Gloucester is we operate 7 surface water supplies, and all of the watershed land around those is protected by zoning, because we've made really good decisions about how we protect our water supply. So I don't know where you would cite a place that you could essentially have a new station, and also that would be an area that you'd want to have this kind of development. Again, we are working with these guidelines that are provided to us, and understand that, you know, there's a lot of concern about, there's already congestion in the downtown area. And I think that'll be one of those scenarios that'll be discussed, is whether or not that can be really minimized. And also to the point of, it's a little bit counter to the whole title of the law, is the area doesn't have to be within the half a mile. So there are definitely scenarios and areas that can be identified to spread the capacity and the density out throughout the community. So I don't know that there's a silver bullet of 100 acres somewhere that we want to direct a new station to and have a high density district. But there definitely are options of way of easing the additional capacity or potential units in the downtown area.
Thank you. So, sir, you've already spoken, correct? Yes. So let's just hang on until we have some other people who haven't spoken, and then I'll make another round if we have plenty of time, which it seems like we will. But yes.
Hi, good evening. My name is Catherine Goodick. I live at 10 Dogtown Road. I'm a lifelong resident here, and I actually grew up in a very congested downtown by the train. So I know everyone's concerned about it. And although it's not my favorite proposal, my concern is really all the infrastructure. And I know it was very nice to hear that there are some ways that you can mitigate some of that 2,200 units. So that was really nice. But you can't mitigate all 2,000. So that's still a lot of families coming in. And when you look at the sewer system problem, the other cabling problems, the infrastructure we have, the school systems, Gloucester just really seems, again, I'm not picking on anybody, but it seems like a broken system with so many things. My concern is having all these new housings coming in. Is there something built into the plan that's going to alleviate the concerns of the residents that have lived here or are living here of how that's going to happen? Because I just keep seeing these multi-million-dollar houses going up. My taxes don't go down, and we're building more infrastructure in, and it's taken away. I mean, Good Harbor Beach, the sewer system keeps backing up. You know, it's, you know, I'm just concerned. It's a great little community. I love it here, and most people do, and it just feels like, I know it's not your fault. The MBTA, I've seen people on the train. There aren't that many people coming here, so it just seems kind of ridiculous. But I just know if there's some way of mitigating some of the expenses or looking at how the infrastructure is. Thank you.
Thank you. The question is there some way of mitigating the infrastructure issues?
I think as a community like this, there's constant renewal of infrastructure. You know, there is no stopping for public works. There's always going to be the continued replacement, expansion of the system. You know, the way that things have been zoned right now, I mean, that's the opportunity that somebody has when they buy residentially zoned land. So we certainly have seen a number of units, particularly in the last 5 years, that have been a little bit of uptick. Some of that's been associated with some of those larger projects. Larger projects, we typically have the opportunity to try to do exactly what you're talking about in terms of mitigating impacts. A lot of infrastructure renewal went in when the Halyard project went in. A lot of neighborhoods had improved infrastructure. And sometimes it takes some of those larger projects to do some of that work. But I think there's also been the request already to have a little bit better of assessment of where we are. And that's something we'll certainly carry back to the administration to be a part of the discussion when it gets to the planning board and city council.
Thank you. Any other questions besides the people that have already gone, and then we'll start calling on them? Yes, ma'am.
Jane Fox, 14 Becker Circle. I have a couple of questions. One, the new Y, which is beautiful, is that going to be counted because there's no one living there? The new Y that's going up, because it's not really.
You mean on Middle Street?
If that's going to be counted towards the count. Because no one's living there.
We're counting housing units, not people.
Right, so it's a housing unit, isn't it?
Correct.
So will it be counted as part of this new MBTA? Because it's in the train station.
It depends on where we put the districts. I mean, I think we've answered that question. Greg, correct me if I'm wrong, but we're zoning for capacity. So if that is in one of the zones where we are zoning for a certain capacity, it will have capacity.
Okay.
And it will have that much capacity.
Okay. Well, only because you're saying existing, and it's kind of in the middle. It's under construction.
It's existing.
Okay. The other thing I want to ask you is, I know she had a lot of purple out there in West Gloucester. My question is this three family by right, if you live in a neighborhood where you go to 3 family or one family to 2 family, then you still have to meet all the septic requirements, correct?
Correct.
So, okay, so what do you do with water? In other words, they're either going to have to put a well in, or the city's going to have to provide water, because the water lines are private. There's a lot of private streets there, and the homeowners own the water lines.
So I'll just speak to that's one of the kind of interesting things about the law is it doesn't require the city to do anything from an infrastructure standpoint. So sites like you suggested, if they are limited by water and they don't have a private solution and the city doesn't have the infrastructure there, it's not the responsibility of the city to extend it. So you may zone for properties that still have other issues that would complicate their potential development. Septic is certainly one. Again, by the law, if you zone it such that a 3-family can be sited that meets dimensional requirements, that meets the letter of the law and gets counted towards the capacity. If that's a ledgy lot, then it'll never be built on, but it counts towards the capacity.
Okay, but my question is there's homes now in my street. They're going from 1 family to 2 families. So they're increasing.
Jane, time. Finish your sentence, but your time is up.
Okay, but so my question is they can't tap into the water lines.
So you're speaking to a very specific example that has nothing to do with what's being discussed to be acted on in the future. So I'm not, if someone's converting right now to a 2-family, it goes through the permitting process and they have to have domestic water supply and they have to have a wastewater solution. So I'm happy to, direct you to go to the building department to see how things were permitted. But, someone has to have domestic water supply and a permanent wastewater solution in order to get a building permit.
Okay.
Yep.
In other words, you can't get a building permit unless you can have a water solution, no matter what kind of zoning you have. Yes, I saw a hand over here. Yes, go ahead. You haven't spoken yet, right? You're sitting next to near the man in the black t-shirt. So.
Hi, Peter Dolan, 150 Mount Pleasant Avenue. Thank you again for taking the time to patiently explain all this to us. I just had a question because I keep hearing about the number of people that are going to be coming here. How much additional housing, how many new housing units does the law require us to build?
0.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, way in the back. Yep. And then did I see a hand up? Oh, yep. Okay, you're next.
Hi, thank you. Patty Page, 3 Tidal Cove Way. In the R5 district, I saw that really quick slide with the brown area that said, this is all R5. I doubt Greg made any mistakes. However, the end of Gloucester Ave is R10, and I don't know how far that R10 comes. Did you account for the R10 as well there? That would be a question. In the downtown, the R5, we're well aware that there's a lot of non-compliance. Lot sizes aren't up to 5,000 or more, and other non-compliance, such as in setbacks and those kind of things, aren't adequate. All of those pieces would not count towards compliance. In the next meeting or two to the planning board or to the public on June 12th, will you have actual granular data that says these lots are actually non-compliant and these are? So that we can kind of see what we're working with. I would assume you'd have to have that knowledge in order to make some determination whether you're going to lower lot sizes or not. So that would be a second question. And lot area coverage, can we limit that? And would the state allow a limit to lot area coverages?
Thank you. I think that was 3 questions.
I can speak to the map piece. It's off of our map GIS. The end of Gloucester Ave is not included in the R5. It's actually off. So it isn't the dark brown, the end of Gloucester Ave.
Right, but the R10 must extend past the end of Gloucester. I'm sure it's correct. It just
certainly, yeah, that's just a static pull off of our online GIS of the zoning district. So I didn't draw any of those. Those are what equate to the zoning map. So yeah, that resolves that one. You can speak to the.
Sure. So for non-compliant lots in the R5, we've I didn't show it today because we're just QA/QCing it, but we do have mapped the 5,000 square foot lots and then which ones are under 5,000. We have that mapped already. We also have tied to each of the parcels, the existing unit count from the city's assessor and from their database. So we also know how many units exist. One of the challenging things would be around like setbacks, like measuring all those setbacks, especially side yard and things. That I just will say, we won't have that. But the thing that we could do, if there was an overlay district potentially proposed for some of the R5, we could maybe look at what the excuse me, not what the setbacks are today. We could look at where the buildings are sited today and potentially adjust those setbacks to maybe make more conformity in the future. So that's something we can certainly look at. And then for the question about lot coverage, that is absolutely allowed by the state. And it's also a piece of the MBTA compliance model that we could consider if that's something the city would want to look at. We can factor things like that in.
Thank you, Patty.
Can we publicly get that analysis yet? Is that distributable to the public?
It's not ready, I believe.
Bring that to the June 6th.
Thank you. Tracy.
I just wanted to add one more thing to the comment. As we consider whatever the form this takes, there are additional standards that could also be applied. We currently don't have any standards for building type, roof line. These are all things that could be considered. I know there's been discussion in the past also about parking requirements. It's also something that can be considered. So, I think that's part of the trade-off of if we are going to enter into a scenario where we have to allow a multifamily by a building permit, we want to make sure that the things that folks are most concerned about are mitigated. So that can include a combination of new standard for parking. It can be also standards for the design of the building and some of the comments that were just raised in terms of what the dimensional requirements for a new 3-family might look like.
Thank you. Tracy O'Neill, 12 Friend Street. I live in the R5 downtown district, half mile within the train station, within a half mile of the train station. And you mentioned parking, and I noticed on this sheet, I didn't want to say this. First of all, the R5 downtown district, what is the unit capacity right now? It's 26 units per acre, is that right? Or is it 17? Is it 17?
So for a 2-family allowed by right, 17 units per acre would be the calculation. But again, it all is a matter of what complies right now.
Okay.
So for an undersized lot, somebody would have to take another permitting path with a variance in order to build a 2-family.
Okay, so if you put an overlay district on top of that, then it would be 26 units per acre, right?
If you were to allow a 3-family on a 5,000 square foot lot.
Right, that's
6 units.
that's the goal though, right?
That's a scenario.
Okay,
Yep.
so the existing 2 families that are there don't count. So look at Maplewood Ave, right? If you go down Maplewood Ave from Derby Street to Gloucester Ave, say, both sides of the street are pretty much 2, maybe 3-family houses. If they're all 2-family houses, let's pretend that there are 20 2-family houses, so that's 40 units. If you put an overlay district on that, that would be 60, right? But we'd only get credit for 20, correct?
No, towards the capacity, you would be counting that you're allowing for a 3-family. So present day, there would be 40 units. There would be the potential to be 20 more units if everyone exercised their rights under the zoning and added a 3rd unit.
Right, but we don't get credit for 20 capacity because what is on the ground now doesn't count, doesn't go towards capacity.
Right.
So you only get credit for the 20.
No, you'd get credit under your scenario. You would get credit for the full 60 because it's just a zoning exercise and zoning is agnostic about what exists. So the best way that I've been thinking about explaining it is pretend under your scenario, you took that block that you described. You you raise the entire block, you wipe it clean,
Mhm.
and you apply the zoning overlay that says on a blank slate, you could do 3-family on, let's pretend all those lots are 5,000 square feet. You can do a 3-family on all those lots, and you could have a maximum capacity of 60 units. We would get the credit for the full 60, not the delta between what exists today and the zoning. So the best way to think about it is the zoning is completely agnostic about what exists today. It's just about what the zoning would allow under a future scenario.
Tracy, that's 2 minutes. Do you have more questions?
Well, I have.
If you have another question, I'm going to ask you to sit down and take another turn. Thank you. And just to reiterate what Rick said over here, it's about what you could do, not what exists. So the number that we're looking for is what we could build, not what is currently built. Yes, back there. Sorry. No. Yep, in the way back, and then in the pink pants next. Nope, you're next. Yep, sorry. You're wearing a skirt. She's wearing pants.
Hi, Erin George, 79 Mount Pleasant Ave here in Gloucester. Fellow lifelong Gloucester resident that was temporarily displaced due to not being able to find housing within the city. I think we definitely have a housing crisis and implore the city to do what we can to try and fix it as part of this process. I grew up in West Gloucester. We have an aging population here in Gloucester, as much as we might find that difficult to admit. And I think there's a need for multi-generational housing in the community. I think we did a really great job not recognizing we actually have it here with many of the 3-family pluses that you showed. So I would wonder, my question, I guess, is what the appetite is for this on the city's part to do more outside of the R5 district for by right 2 families, or even going as bold as by right 3 families. I grew up in West Gloucester. My parents are aging. They probably wouldn't want me to build a unit to be closer to them, but thinking as their health evolves and things like that, does the city see that as a tenable solution? Because I think that would be a good way to meet the needs of the community that is aging. And also the different approaches. It seems like you guys have an open mind of, I think we need to do a lot of different things, so I'd encourage you to do that. But my other question was actually, even though it doesn't meet the MBTA zoning requirements, could we still give 2 families by right as part of this, even though it wouldn't go towards the MBTA goal, but just to have it as part of the zoning within Gloucester?
So the good news is every residential zoning district right now, other than the RC 40, allows 2-family by right. So R5, R10, R20, R30, R40, and R80 all allow 2-family right now. And actually some changes were made 2 years ago to ease that in some of the districts, not requiring double the lot area in those districts for 2-family. The question about 3-family in some of those other districts, that's again, what's been modeled in some of these scenarios for consideration for the planning board and the city council. And the other thing I would add is on single-family lots, there's also the allowance for accessory dwelling units by right. So that's another housing option for folks to consider. It can either be within the structure or a standalone accessory dwelling unit.
Yep, these are all great questions. Thanks, everybody. Right here.
Good evening, Brianna Hodgkins, 8 Viking Street. This piggybacks a little bit about what she asked, but is there an appetite for the city to lower the restrictions on the types of buildings? I think you mentioned it a little bit, but there's a lot of restrictions on foundation types, on whether is movable or not movable. Is there an appetite to change those restrictions?
I'm not sure what kind of restrictions you're referring to.
So for example, I believe we're not allowed to have mobile homes or even modular type of structures in the city. I'm not 100% sure, but I know similar cities like Rockport you can't have movable, living situations. So there's a lot of other opportunities to build besides, I think, what we're seeing being proposed. And is there an appetite to change some of those existing laws to favor, like she said, existing families building on their properties?
Thank
Yeah,
you.
I would say the accessory dwelling unit is probably one of the most recent considerations for alternative types of housing. I know things on wheels, like tiny houses and that type of thing, actually have some state building code issues right now that are still being worked out are still a limitation. I think that the accessory dwelling unit was something that was considered in that context to provide other options. I'm not sure exactly what you mean about modular, I mean, construction type. I mean, modular construction is certainly
I can give you an example. I recently had some damage to my home and was misplaced for 6 months. The city denied allowing me, I'd have to go for a special permit. But in those circumstances, as a family with 2 young children in school, I didn't have the time to go file special permits. I was denied to be able to have a modular home put in. I'm not sure the technical name of it, but they're to be put in because it's not part of the laws in Gloucester. So there are restrictions on the type of homes you can build.
I think I'd say I do a follow-up because it sounds fairly specific, but maybe a little bit longer of a discussion.
Absolutely, thank you.
Sure.
I have one.
You have 30 seconds.
Thank you. The other question is what types of housing has been considered outside of the triplexes? Is there any other considerations of types of buildings that we would get us to where we need to be?
So far, building type hasn't been again, the baseline is 3-family. Some of the districts that have been looked at have really been looked at based on their size and what capacity that they would provide in terms of number of units. But form is really also another part of the discussion for the planning board and city council.
Thank you. Anyone else besides previous speakers who have a question? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Beverly Palmacci, Commonwealth Avenue. I have a general question. Do we know what our goal is, the city's goal? And who is deciding what the goal is? Is it the planning board? Is it the mayor? I was under the impression the mayor would be here and we would be conversing with him. Are we trying to meet the guidelines by doing as little as possible? Are we trying to meet the guidelines by doing as much as possible? What are we after? And how are we going to find out? Can you answer that question?
Sure. The decision makers, and some of them are in the room, and I earlier introduced the city councilors and planning board members are present, and I want to recognize that Councilor Worthley is in the back of the room right there. So ultimately, the decision will be made by the city council, but it will be a proposal that will be developed through the planning board in concert with the city council. They are the ones that will decide whether this is a minimal approach or whether it does something more that like was outlined in the initial presentation. So it's up to the planning board and the city council to decide.
I will amend. It's up to the planning board and the city council to decide with public input, because there will be public hearings on any proposal in which the public can say they love it or they hate it or they want to tweak it or whatever. And that will be taken into consideration before any decision is made. And as far as the overall goal, the goal is compliance. That's the only goal.
So the city council is to listen to the planning board,
The planning board makes a recommendation to the city council.
what they feel is best.
Yes, after public hearings.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else besides previous speakers? Yes, Barnaby.
Hello. Hi, Barnaby Prendergast, 61 Fernald Street. I have a question about height. There's a lot of chatter about there being no restrictions on height, but my understanding is that we have basically full control of height of the So the next question is how, for the 3-family buildings, the picture showed some buildings which look to me to be a bit taller than 30 feet. How are we going to fit 3-family into our current 30-foot zoning limit? And I'll.
Thank you.
So there are certainly current 3 families that are meeting the 30-foot height limitation right now. That's certainly a consideration. Right now, it's a height exception to the Zoning Board of Appeals if you want to go up to 35 feet. If you want to incorporate design requirements, for instance, for a pitched roof that might require more than 30 feet, you could write it into the zoning. But the baseline right now is it is 30 feet, and you can fit 3 stories or 2.5 that would potentially comply with providing 3 units in a 3-family. So definitely part of the discussion, a good consideration in terms of, again, if Gloucester's by right zoning right now does not really get into design, there is the opportunity to do that. If again, the trade-off is we have to provide a zoning district that allows for 3-family by right. It is zoning, but eventually somebody will build a 3-family if it's allowed. But that's, that's part of the longer discussion after we get past the where, how many units. It gets also into actually writing the zoning of what people are going to be required to do.
Thank you. Anyone else who hasn't already spoken? And while you're thinking about that, I'll just remind you all that this presentation tonight and previous presentations and meeting recordings and an explanation of what's going on is on the city website. If you just Google City of Gloucester MBTA or 3A zoning. So I have on my short list of previous speakers who weren't done, Deanna and the gentleman in the black t-shirt whose name I forget, sorry, and then Tracy. So Deanna, we'll go next with you. And if anybody else thinks of another question in the meantime, we can pop you in the queue.
Thank you. So thinking about making this the best possible plan for Gloucester and bringing the best results, a couple of things that I've been thinking about and hearing a lot of people in the community referencing. Could it be possible to, wherever the overlay is, to have restrictions or limitations within the overlay that does not allow for anything new or created to not be short-term rentals? So could the districts, could they restrict or prohibit short-term rentals within the districts? I guess that's what I'm thinking. And then the other piece of that is that there's a lot of sort of local conversations around, this isn't going to create housing for locals. So is there anything that can be done to be written in as a restriction? Or you talked about sort of creating criteria or modeling around building characteristics and height and all of that sort of thing. But is, writing in is there any, local preference opportunities in anything within the district creations, if that makes any sense?
Does make sense in terms of a question. So I'll take that one first, and then we can talk about short-term rentals. So in terms of local preference for just like your typical market rate unit that doesn't have any deed restrictions, I don't believe you can do that. Where I've seen local preference come in would be through a lottery system for deed restricted affordable units. I believe the state lets you go as high as 70% for local preference for those units. So if we're talking about the inclusionary zoning, as we were going back to before, that would be an opportunity for, some of those to be local preference units. For the short-term rental, typically I see that living in the ordinance or a bylaw outside of what we would do in zoning. I'm not familiar with how Gloucester does or doesn't regulate those today, but in terms of like 3A and what the state would look at, there's really no guidance on that aspect of it. I think it would be up to local control and how you'd want to deal with that.
Yeah, and no one can hear you, but I think I can restate what you just said. Correct me if I'm wrong. You're saying is excluding short-term rentals prohibited in order to be compliant? Is that what you're saying? Can we still comply if we prohibit short-term rentals? Do you know the answer to that?
I think it's something that we're going to try to get some guidance on. I mean, it does kind of make sense. How is it suitable for a family if it's only available for 30 days? But it also addresses other issues of concern. So it's a good question. Thank you.
Thank you. Any new speaker before I go to the next person on my list? Okay, gentleman in the black t-shirt.
Gentleman with the black t-shirt, 33 Middle Street. Peter Johnson.
I'll always know you.
So first of all, I appreciate that you took serious all the different proposals, or that was the first map you showed, all the different purple areas and everything like that. But when you did go into detail, you obviously focused in on downtown area and the area around this train station down here. So, so this goes to, this is obviously the more dense area already of Gloucester, and a lot of people have already talked about concerns regarding that. So my question is, looking at those other areas, and yeah, another thing is, we need areas 25 acres, if that's correct, right? So looking at those other areas, how serious are you looking at what's the potential for 25-acre area outside of the downtown area? And how likely is it really that, it will not be the downtown area that is that, it will take and satisfy the 25-acre requirement, and how likely is it that actually be possible to split between the two train stations? So that's my question.
Thank you.
So just from our consultant's perspective, in terms of if we're taking it seriously, absolutely. We modeled them all. And I would say actually most of the districts that we modeled based on the public feedback from that first meeting are far larger than 25 acres. So I think if there's appetite from the planning board and the city council to explore those areas, we can certainly find some districts outside of the 2.5-mile areas that would comply with the law. Now, whether there's the appetite to look at those is not a question I can answer. But in terms of what we're modeling and what we're doing, we're 100% taking it seriously and taking that input seriously.
Yeah, I guess the appetite will come down to politics and what the people of Gloucester want or do not want. But yeah, thank you for the answer.
Hang on, Jason, did you have a question? Oh, I will check for Zoom callers. There's only a few people on Zoom. Why don't we let Tracy go because she is next. But I would remind everybody on Zoom, if you have a question, you can use your raise the hand button at the bottom of your screen and you will be recognized after Tracy. Oh, thank you. Okay. So we'll give Zoom callers a minute or two to find their raise the hand button. Is there any? Oh, yeah. Hold on, Valerie. There's a guy behind you who has not spoken yet. A guy in the black gym jacket.
Stephen Aiello, 22 Linden Road. Kudos on the presentation. I actually gained a lot of information here tonight. A couple things. First of all, the goal of the exercise initially was to create affordable housing. So can we, during this process, or is this something that the planning board can do, or is it the city council to increase that inclusionary up to 15% and drop the AMI down to like 50%? How does that happen?
So we already have an ordinance in place that requires 15%, and it provides the option of providing 10% of the units if you go to deeper affordability at 60% of the area median income for households. So in terms of how to apply it, it's really a matter of what we're talking about in terms of the type of multifamily housing. As we said, if the baseline that the state is looking for is a 3-family, if we zone for something greater than that, that meets our threshold, then that's when the inclusionary would
Well,
potentially apply.
that was my next question is right now, I believe it's at 8 families or above. The trick kick
6 units.
6 or above. So in this process, we could lower that to 3. Could we, or?
It's a separate ordinance, but that's a possibility. It's a pretty high
Right.
burden on construction costs to have a deed restricted unit down at that level.
Right.
And that's where I think, to Eric's point, they would start looking at the financial feasibility of that.
So, and I was pleased to learn that you're looking at possible multiple zones. For instance, downtown in the R5, it's going to be a struggle to find a lot of lots that are in compliance. But when you look at Lexington Avenue and Hesperus Avenue and Mount Pleasant Avenue and East Main Street and other neighborhoods, it's possible if you dropped overlay districts in those areas, you'd find more dwellings that were in compliance than in the R5 district. So that is something that you're looking at?
It's definitely part of the scenarios that will be presented.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so we have nobody on Zoom who has a question. And we have we have 2 more questions. We have maybe 3 more questions. So Jane has already spoken. I'm going to call on Sunny first, and then the guy with the crutches. And then Jane, we have 15 more minutes, everybody. So we are going to have a hard stop at 8 o'clock. But go ahead, Sunny.
Thank you very much. Sunny Robinson, 20 Harvard Street. We've had a lot of discussion about the value of 3-family units as good units to consider because they fit pretty well with a great deal of our downtown area. But if we are trying to maximize what we can do about affordability while we also address 3A, don't we need to think about how we zone so that in fact there can be 6-unit buildings, 8-unit buildings, so that we actually trigger the relatively progressive code that we already have and around inclusionary zoning, and also have an easier time of demonstrating the feasibility rather than thinking about the difficulty of going to a lower trigger unit of 3 or 4.
Thank you.
Just in terms of what we're modeling, yes, I think that's on the table. And if the city's goal is to leverage inclusionary zoning as a way to help produce affordable units and get more in the city, then under your scenario, that would be the way to do it. More total units is going to equal more affordable units just by way of the inclusionary. But again, it's going to come down to that policy choice.
Great, thanks. I'm going to bring the mic to you, not make you get up. But just your name and address for the record.
Thank you. Gregory Doe, 7 Whites Mountain Road in Gloucester, West Gloucester. Is Gloucester's goal just to meet mandate and produce a color-coded map? Or can this be smart urban planning? The downtown railroad corridor is a mix of spot zoning, commercial buildings, industrial lots, vacant land, which could be transformed into improvement and an asset to the city and also meet the mandate. Another question, how will we control the developers from destroying the city with that color-coded map? And how are you not going to destroy West Gloucester? Because I can't see that one happening. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
So again, I think what's going to be presented to the planning board are a series of options. We know that some portion of what needs to be zoned is going to be within one of the train station areas. But then the possibilities are pretty broad. Those scenarios that were modeled for some of the areas in West Gloucester certainly have their challenges, and that will be, part of the discussion as to whether or not to pursue it at all. It's something that could fall off in the first discussion. And again, a little bit to Sunny's comment, the baseline is a 3-unit building. If the city wants to consider something more than that, again, it also relates to lot size, so you have to zone it so that it actually can be, a possibility. That's one of the challenging things is you can't consider lots being combined. It has to basically be something that can go forward if it meets all the dimensional requirements. In an ideal world, we would have a new district of, virgin land that we created a 8,700 square foot district that could have a 3-family, and we'd be at 15 units per acre, and maybe, 2,270 new units will be built. That's not the scenario that we're working with. We have a district that's far smaller than that. It's at 26 units per acre with a 3-family on it. And there's all these considerations also for, things that don't comply. So I'm not sure that this is the most difficult puzzle that RKG has been presented with. As they've helped about, a couple dozen communities do this, where in some scenarios, they're just putting, one district over one area and really not kind of spending a lot of time in the details because they don't think anything's going to happen in an industrial district. There's been examples of an Amazon warehouse district being overlaid to have multifamily that meets the capacity of some communities. So not a lot of imagination, and I think some hopes that nothing will happen. In our scenario, I think there's definitely some potential for something to happen because we're talking about residentially zoned districts, and we already have a lot of 3-family allowance by special permit. So it's all part of the mix, and I don't think anybody's intention, as you look in the eyes of the city council members and the planning board members, they're not going to want to pursue something that's going to damage the community, particularly in sensitive areas. So to the point about floodplain, these are all things that the planning board and the city council can kind of set up of tenets of where we want to consider things, what we consider sensitive. A lot of those areas have already been removed by the excluded areas. So I think there's some belt and suspenders already built into the modeling, but you bring great points, and I hope everybody here continues to participate in the process.
Okay, it's 10 of 8. Jane, did you have another question? Yes, no? Okay, and I see 2 more speakers, and after that, we're gonna cut it off. So Valerie is next, and the woman with the nice leopard scarf will be last. Thank you, and keep it to 2 minutes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I thank you for the opportunity tonight to hear everybody. I really appreciate it. I have one question. With this new, I understand the by right, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 by special permit. And everything has to still be under compliance. However, are the abutters still going to get notices? It's something I was just wondering. So if you get a 3-family home next door to you, you're going to get any type of notice, or is it just by right and the neighbors don't get a notice anymore?
Thank you.
I think the only thing that I'm not sure that, we would have to set up a new process. The state law dictates when folks get notified, whether there's a variance or a special permit filed with the zoning board, the planning board, the city council. Site plan review right now is something that's been identified that can be required as part of any by right permit. So as of right now, if these districts had some standards that were put in place in site plan, you'd have to follow the agendas of whichever body is identified to review those. Most typically, it's the planning board. I'm not sure that there would be the allowance of a noticing requirement, because unless it's in site plan, there's nobody to notice. Who would you go to? You could come down and see the building inspector and but it would just be the noticing that a building permit's been filed for a 3-family. So the only thing I could say is if there's consideration for site plan, it would be placed on a planning board agenda. It would, those are not public hearing items. So it would be the discretion of the chair to even take comment. And again, if something is satisfying the requirements, the intent of this law is to say you can go pursue a building permit.
Right. So just right now, if you're building a house and you comply with all the requirements, there's no requirement to notify the abutters. You only have to notify the abutters when you have to get a special permit. So at this point, or go to the ZBA or something like that. Valerie, 2 minutes. Is it on? Hang on, can't hear you. Is the button pushed up?
No, it wasn't. Okay, thank you. In the downtown area, I'm struck with how much you're relying on the 3-family, but Sunny appropriately has brought up larger units, as you have, Greg, as well. In the downtown area, there are already existing many unit structures. And there's vacant land, so there actually could be maybe some more multi-unit structures built. In the Lanesville meeting, Jason was saying that what you would do is create within, say, the 25 acres, little sub-districts for the big places already there. So as you said, Greg, it burned down, you'd have the right to build up that. Or, so that's one way to sweep those numbers of units by right into your total. Or are you going to do something like set a lot area coverage requirement that you have to be like the size of those lots in order to be that many units? So how are you planning to count and include all, which you've mentioned, Greg, as a goal? How are you thinking about doing that?
So again,
thank you.
The minimum size of any district is 5 acres. So there's certainly pockets within the downtown area that have higher density that you could include in its own 5-acre district with its own set of standards. If some of those areas have one building standing on it with, I don't know, 80 units in it, 4.5, 5-story, you can say that you can put that back by standard and you can count those 80 units there or whatever it might be that you could also provide some sort of allowance if that structure ever had to come down and be rebuilt. So you can get very specific. This can be multiple districts. It's a little bit of an abacus. I mean, it's a puzzle. We have to get to 2,270 units. You can do it with the existing built housing by zoning for it to be allowed to be rebuilt and taking credit for that. I like that one better than counting. So it's complex, and we can start with, if that's the approach, with saying, where can we do that and how many units get accounted for in the capacity, and then start looking at the other options. So again, I think it's been said over and over again, are we going for pursuing additional new housing, or are we going for minimum compliance? And we will present the gamut of those 2 options.
Sunny has certainly brought that up. So.
Thank you. So we have our very last question. And before she speaks, I just want to remind everybody again on this sheet that was available for you to pick up. If you wake up in the middle of the night and you think, oh man, I should have asked that question, there is an email on the bottom, mbtafeedback@gloucester-ma.gov, and you can email your question from now until this process is finished, and we will try to answer it for you. Go ahead, ma'am.
Am I on? Greg, I'd like to personally thank you because you've answered my email so politely, and sometimes I'm a little off the rails, and I apologize. But I was just thinking of this when I was sitting there. There's a floodplain zone, but do you have any documentation of where this new wind zone all of a sudden appeared? And to tell people if they're going to build that they may be in a wind zone? Because it said that I was in a wind zone and they'd had this like wordage like R1 something.
I'm pretty sure that that's something that's tied to insurance rates and maybe referenced through the building code.
Or would it be in the building code so someone would know rather than be stuck like me up somewhere? in a wind zone that I don't want to be.
Yeah, I don't know the direct answer to that, but I will certainly send you an email.
Good, thank you. Take your time, I appreciate it.
Thank you. So that's it, guys. We're done. Thank you so much to Eric and Greg and our own Eric. And everybody for following the ground rules. We really appreciate it and think it was very productive. So we'll see you at the next meeting of June 6th and maybe June 12th and maybe the public hearings. Thank you.
I just want to thank Jane for being the moderator.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Jane.
Have a good night.
Be able to call out everybody's past.